Why did Phil Spencer say that great games won't change Xbox sales or sort of the console landscape? Now, when I covered this originally in my live stream, I sort of took up for Phil Spencer, not because I necessarily was defending what he was saying, but more so saying he was being ripped out of context. Many people were just taking a slice of the quote, ripping it out and saying, oh yeah, Phil Spencer says they don't have to make great games. He was largely saying that the console landscape won't shift just because they start delivering really amazing games, even if Starfield is 11 out of 10. Now, I did disagree with him, though, that that's sort of a very simplistic view of the console market. And we have an article I'm going to be reacting to that essentially says the same thing. There's more to the market than just, oh, we got to convince people on PS5 to leave their PS5 or to sell it to come over to the Xbox. Many people own more than one system these days, and I actually think that if Microsoft would have focused just on having the Xbox Series X instead of having the X and the S, and they would have delivered far better first-party titles, especially first-party next-gen titles, it would have motivated a lot more people to buy an Xbox. Forza Horizon is sort of the only game that really was carrying the next-gen banner, as Halo Infinite kind of staggered out of the gate with its multiplayer in a beta and the campaign being fine, but nothing that we would say is a next-gen representation of the most powerful console. So they didn't get off to a great start, and they could have if they were spending more time investing in their studios, investing in their own property, and if they would have better invested in the hardware. I do think the Series S was a mistake. I think that's making the ecosystem very unpopular with third-party developers because it requires extra development time, and now that we're seeing their hardware sales are down, I think it's sort of already written a future for them where they're not going to get a lot of third-party deals. They're just not going to. There's not a real reason to develop for two systems, especially a system that has less market share and is on pace to fall way behind, as PlayStation 5 market share is on pace to pass the PlayStation 4 sales saturation. So let's take a look at this article from The Gamer. I do want to say I'm not a fan of people doing this on their thumbnails. I'm especially not a fan of an outlet like The Gamer. This seems a little unprofessional to make Phil Spencer look like that. I know why. There's like meme YouTube channels and like bro channels that are like super fanboy oriented, and they do this to Jim Ryan. They do this to Phil Spencer. I think outlets like The Gamer should sort of be above that. That just seems very unprofessional and childish. And I wanted to say that because it's in my video and, I'm reacting to their article. And I just think that's very unnecessary. It seems, beneath an outlet like this. But anyway, Phil Spencer shared his thoughts on the console race in a recent interview, but his comments don't ring true to Xbox's own strategy. I'm fairly impressed by Phil Spencer's recent interview appearance on Kindafunny XCast. His candor when faced with hard questions about Redfall's failure was refreshing. He didn't try to make excuses for Redfall or obfuscate the situation at all, and he took personal responsibility for not being involved enough in the development process and providing Arcane with the resources that it clearly needed. I'm just going to echo again that he all but confirmed my theory that Redfall had its development disrupted, basically. They were mid-development, and I think they were told to change direction. I don't think they just scrapped a version for PS5, and I think Phil Spencer confirms that in the interview. If you listen very closely, he said that Harvey and the team should have gotten more support. They should do a better job when they grab a project mid-development. They said they did a better job with Starfield because it was earlier in development. Very clear picture that Microsoft was the causality there. They're the reason that Redfall turned out the way that it did. Anybody trying to, play like blame shift and like, oh, it's all on Arcane. I think Phil Spencer made that very difficult in this interview. Anybody trying to sort of wave the hand of like, oh, Microsoft's not to blame here. Just because they were hands off doesn't mean they didn't disrupt the project and then sort of set it up for failure. I believe the game was basically built in 2 years. Anyway, I don't want to pat Spencer too much on the back. Microsoft still charged $70 for a dud game, and I don't believe the poor reception is as shocking to Spencer as he claimed it was. That was one part of the interview that was pretty alarming, that like they did mock reviews and this thing was falling double digits below. Keep in mind when Phil Spencer said that, it was in the 60s. It's now fallen to 58 on Metacritic on the home console of the Series X. But CEOs of game companies don't usually get in front of influencers to take their lumps for bad games. games, and I think that's worth acknowledging. I definitely think it's worth acknowledging too, but I also feel like it was a bit of an audition, maybe even sort of like a resume, being like, hey, I can go out here and take my lumps. I'm probably on my way out. Microsoft's going to blame everything on him. 20 years of failure for Xbox, and they're going to act like it's just one person's fault again instead of corporate structural problems or policy problems within Microsoft itself. So Spencer was a lot more transparent in the interview than I expected him to be, but there was one part that came across as extremely disingenuous to me. At the end of the interview, while offering his final thoughts, Spencer started talking about its position in the console market relative to Sony and Nintendo. Here's the full quote. Now, it's a lengthy quote, but we need to read it because so many people are taking this quote out of context. I really put a lot of PlayStation fan channels and fan accounts on Twitter. I put them on blast about this. I didn't call it anybody specifically, but I just said, you're not doing yourselves any favor, because the Xbox guys do the exact same thing with Jim Ryan. They did the exact same things with We Believe in Generations, which is infuriating to see people who just don't understand basic grammar and like diagramming a sentence or understanding what, context is. And I just don't appreciate that. So, I think it's good to read the entirety of this. We're not in the business of outselling Sony or out-consoling Nintendo. There isn't really a great solution or win for us. I know this will upset a ton of people. I think he knew this was going to upset people. I'm kind of surprised he said all of this. But it's just the truth of the matter. When you're third place in the console marketplace and the top two players are as strong as they are, and in certain cases have very discrete focus in doing deals and other things, making being on Xbox as hard on the team, that's on us. That's not anybody else. Our vision is that everybody that's on console has to feel like they have a great experience and they're not, and they're a first-class citizen. He's pushing back against the notion. Many people were sort of saying consoles were second-class citizen because they just didn't seem to matter. They've invested a ton in our platform, but we're not in a position, and I see it out there. I see commentary that if you just build great games, everything would turn around. It's just not true. That if we go off and build great games, all of a sudden you're going to see console shares shift in some dramatic way. Now, again, you have to understand the commentary here is if you just build great games, everything will turn around. Like, all they have to do is build amazing games and they'll win people over from Sony, right? And he says, we lost the worst generation to lose in the Xbox One generation when everybody built their digital library of games. Digital continuity is a huge factor. You have this huge backlog, and he basically says that we lost that worst generation. And I think that candor is very important for people to understand what happened. If you're going to try to blame Phil Spencer, you need to understand that when the Xbox One against the PS4 fell all the way down the stairs, we can't lay all that at his feet, okay? That was not entirely his baby. That was not entirely his responsibility. There was tech investment. There was R&D. There were decisions about the Kinect. There were decisions about always online that we can't hold him responsible for. I'm going to continue to say that I believe this is a corporate level strategy problem with Microsoft, and we're seeing that met out in the hardware sales versus the PlayStation 5 and Mark Cerny and everything he did for the PS5 and what that's doing for developers wanting to build for the PS5. And then Xbox comes out this generation and does it again. They're like, oh, let's do a Series S and a Series X. They don't listen to the developers at all. They basically make it harder to develop next-gen titles for their platform. And it's hard to think that that's all something that Phil Spencer did. Like, he obviously is a part of it, and he's a part of it, and he accepts responsibility for everything that happened. But if we're going to try and continue to blame all of Xbox's failures on him, I just think you're going to continue to see the platform struggle. I think it's far deeper and more endemic to creative work underneath Microsoft's ownership. He says, we want our Xbox community to feel awesome, but this idea that if we just focus more on great games on our console, that somehow we're going to win the console race doesn't really lay in reality. So he's again stating that if you think you're going to turn the console race around with great games, it's not that simple. That's, I think, a fair-made point that's getting lost in people sort of ripping it out of context. That's, again, why I'm sort of rereading this. Anybody who watched my breakdown heard me say some of this, but this is, I think it's good for people to see the quote in its entirety. Most people, 90% of people that walk into a retailer to buy a console are already a member of one of the three ecosystems. Their digital library is there. This is the first generation where the big games they're playing are games that were available last gen. Fortnite, Roblox, Minecraft. The continuity from generation to generation is so strong. I see a lot of pundits out there that kind of want to go back to the time where we all had cartridges and discs and every new generation was a clean slate and you could switch the whole share. That's just not the world we live in today. There's no world where Starfield is an 11 out of 10 and people start selling their PS5. That's not going to happen. this is where I know the author's going to drill in on, and I think this is a good thing to drill in on, because I do think this is a mistake in not just optics, but in strategy, right? So here we go. I find this to be a rather bizarre statement, and I question what his motivations were for saying it. Far be it for me to tell the CEO of Xbox his business, but there's some things that were said here that don't ring true at all. It does provide some valuable insight, and it's definitely important to recognize that the game industry has changed a lot since the year of cartridges and discs. I understand the point that Spencer is making about focusing on building a brand that isn't trying to beat Sony and Nintendo at their own game, but I think there's something off about the way he's framing the problems Microsoft faces and downplaying the importance of quality games. That is, I think, a takeaway that is worrisome. Like, if you're going to downplay the importance of quality games, where does that stand sort of in the spectrum of importance? Since they're saying, oh, that's not really going to change anything, well, does that mean everything that's going to come out is going to be like, what, a 7 and an 8? And like that to you is all that needs to happen? I would be concerned about that if I was only in the Xbox ecosystem. Spencer's position is that Microsoft lost the console war during the Xbox One generation, and that because of things like digital libraries and live service games, there's no way it will ever catch up and win. Sony and Nintendo build incredible digital catalogs and now live on modern consoles, and it's not in Microsoft's best interest to try to compete by putting all of its effort into releasing system-selling games. Microsoft's strategy is to deliver differentiating value in other ways, through Game Pass, cloud streaming, and its Play Anywhere ecosystem. Microsoft is never going to release more good games than PlayStation and Nintendo, so it isn't trying to compete in that way. Now, he didn't say that. He didn't say they're not trying to compete with good games, but if you look at the efforts as of late, it certainly seems like that's not the focus. The problem is that the console war isn't a zero-sum game. This is well stated. The Xbox Series X and S don't need to outsell the PS5 or the Switch to be considered a successful console, and no one that looks at the video game business seriously would suggest that. I don't understand why Spencer feels the need to frame this in such a reductive win-lose way, when all Xbox owners want more high-quality games than they're getting now. Not only that, you don't need to state it in such a reductive win-loss way, because there are people who would buy an Xbox One even though they already have a PlayStation 5. It's not like you have to convince them to literally throw their PS5 in the garbage or get rid of it or sell it to get an Xbox Series X. It's not like they're, magnets that repel each other in your home. You can have both in your home. Trust me, I have both in my home right now. And yeah, and again, beyond that, Xbox owners want quality games. Like, they want to buy quality games, so make them, right? And you might get more people into your ecosystem. Even if you're not trying to sell consoles with games, aren't you trying to get people into your ecosystem? I would think that would be the case. Spencer is totally right when he says Starfield isn't going to get people to sell their PS5s no matter how good it is, but that's a weird way to look at the market. If Starfield was an 11 out of 10 and there were 3 Starfields every year on Xbox, then people would buy an Xbox and put it next to their PlayStation. That's exactly right. That's exactly the point that I just made, right? Like, if you're delivering that quality, if Halo Infinite was 11 out of 10, if it was right now maintaining an amazing player base with really great live service content and really good support and really good updates, and had great viewership and great esports events. Listen, that alongside other 11 out of 10 games, award-winning games, yes, people would buy Xboxes. It's not about just getting people to drop their PlayStation. That's really not how gamers operate as much anymore. There are people that do that. They're one system, that's it. But more and more gamers are having multiple systems in their home. How many people do you know right now that have a Nintendo Switch and an Xbox, or a PlayStation and a Nintendo Switch, or any combination of the 3? I think Spencer was off the mark in his remarks here. Again, I think he was right to a degree. We're not going to change the market share. I think they're going to stay in third place, but they could certainly increase their slice of that third piece, of the pie. Spencer points out the ways that the industry has changed since the cartridge days without acknowledging the fact that a lot more people are willing to buy multiple consoles today. Exactly what I just said. These companies aren't fighting over market share the way Nintendo and Sega did, or the way Android and iPhone did. We have PlayStations and Switches because they both have great games. If Xbox had great games, we'd all have an Xbox too. That's exactly right. Gamers just want great games. They don't really care about all this loyalty stuff. I think maybe he's spending a little too much time on Twitter, because Twitter definitely is a place where people get tribalistic and they act like they can only own one box and they worship him or Jim Ryan. And it's like, I keep getting called a Sony pony, and I'm pulling for Xbox because I would love to have too many games to play, right? It's really easy to ignore one system in my house right now, especially with Zelda around the corner, and that's just not a good situation. It really does come down to the games, and I find it strange that Spencer reiterated 3 times in that statement that making great games won't turn anything around. It's a bizarre claim to make when the Switch is proof otherwise. The Wii U sold less than 14 million units in its lifetime, and its failure almost brought Nintendo to its knees. But Nintendo sold 14 million Switches just this year. It sold more than 120 million Switches, and it will sell another 10 before it's done. What turned it all around for Nintendo? Releasing tons of great games. And a lot of those games were first-party games. They were heavily investing in their first-party catalog, which is something that Microsoft has not done. Why it's so frustrating seeing them throwing $70 billion around at Activision Blizzard. It's like so much of that could be invested in your studios. It's true that the Wii U catalog bolstered the Switch. Mario Kart 8 Deluxe is the best-selling game on the console, but new games are what made the Switch the best-selling Nintendo console of all time. Pokemon, Breath of the Wild, Super Mario Bros. Ultimate, Animal Crossing, New Horizons, Super Mario Odyssey, Splatoon 2 and 3. These are the games that turn things around for Nintendo. I love the things that Microsoft is doing to move the industry forward, but still, always will be about the games. The end of this interview makes it seem like Spencer has a defeatist attitude towards Xbox's ability to compete. These comments aren't out of line with things he said back in 2020 about Microsoft vision and his denouncement of console war ideology, but this sentiment doesn't exactly align with Microsoft's actions either. It acquired Bethesda in 2021 to bring high-quality exclusives to Xbox, and it's trying to acquire Activision Blizzard for the same reason. I don't think Spencer is just speaking off the cuff because things seem hopeless for Xbox, but then, why is he saying it? Here's the thing people don't realize, okay? When they bought Bethesda in 2021, they didn't buy Bethesda in 2021 to get really, really good Xbox exclusives. They bought them to stop the bleeding. Nobody sees this. There was a pattern that Bethesda titles were going 1-year exclusive to Sony, right? You had Deathloop, Ghostwire Tokyo. They were in talks to do it with Starfield. I believe they were in talks to do it with Redfall as well. There was a pattern there that Bethesda titles kept hitting 1-year exclusives with Sony first. This is why I think Redfall got demolished, because they were building it for PS5. I think similar things happened with Starfield. It's why they had to send engineers to help get Starfield ready for the Xbox. I believe that was an act of desperation. They bought Bethesda to stop the bleeding and to try to secure first-party property. I also think it's because their studios are not flourishing under their ownership, and I think that's because creative doesn't flourish under Microsoft's ownership, so they were trying to kind of jump ahead. If Microsoft didn't own Bethesda, there would be virtually no first-party presence in 2023, because Hi-Fi Rush wouldn't be on theirs. Redfall, even though it's bad, it was still something they could launch, and then Starfield's around the corner. Those 3 titles would be non-existent as first-party Microsoft exclusives if they hadn't bought Bethesda. And Activision Blizzard was another act of desperation. Look how Microsoft has handled the CMA blocking it. Them and Activision out here being incredibly unprofessional and threatening the UK and saying nasty things about the UK. They're not arguing from a place of power. They're arguing from a place of desperation. Both Bethesda and ABK were Hail Marys to try to give them some semblance of a market share because they have failed so miserably for 20 years. So I don't think Phil Spencer is saying anything off the cuff. I think he's like letting things to the surface that a lot of us have sensed for a long time, and it's that Xbox is doing a terrible job and they haven't gotten out of it because they haven't focused on their own property. They didn't focus on their technology either, because if they would have focused on their technology, they'd be better off securing third-party relationships, and if they would have focused on their developers, they'd have better first-party titles. Throughout the Activision Blizzard acquisition process, an important part of Microsoft's narrative was positioning itself as an underdog. Yeah, because they are in the console world. The scrutiny it faces from regulators is meant to discern whether merging Xbox with Activision Blizzard would make it too powerful and create an anti-competitive risk in the market. By putting himself in the hot seat after a big flop, hat in hand, Spencer has an opportunity to present Microsoft as a distant third in the console race. I don't think Spencer's words are pure theater, but they're likely motivated or at least informed by the ongoing acquisition process. If nothing else, it was certainly a useful way to present Xbox's position in the industry right now. I don't doubt that that's part of this, because they did happen to start with the CMA in the interview, and they were very brief, and he was very dismissive about, like, the CMA, I guess, thinks we have a lead in this cloud market that hasn't emerged yet. That is in fact true. It hasn't emerged yet, and they do have a lead, and the CMA didn't block it because they thought, oh, you own all that property, it's going to prohibit other people from competing. That's not what the CMA said. The CMA said that they wanted the market to emerge from market impact rather than having to have regulation over it at a global scale. They said that the required oversight would be bad for the market. They want to be hands-off and let the market emerge. So he misrepresented what the CMA said anyway. And so he starts with that, and then he goes on this sort of tirade about how, yeah, we're in third and we're not going to win with great games. So maybe that was partially motivated by the acquisition, but I don't know if the CMA is going to be compelled by an interview on an Xbox podcast. People that want Xbox to win are mad about the things Spencer said. Part of me appreciates his willingness to put off the people that consider themselves Xbox's biggest fans, because the console war mentality is toxic to discourse and harmful to this community, and I applaud Spencer for pushing back against it. At the same time, I don't think his words paint an accurate picture of how the industry works, and I can't help but think the CEO of Xbox must know that too. At the end of the day, we all know that Xbox needs more games, and Phil Spencer knows that better than anyone. Certainly he knows that better than anyone, and I don't think he was saying we don't need good games. You're missing the point that he went beyond games. They need services, they need cloud, play anywhere, Game Pass. They're not going to purely win with games. I do agree that his framing of this idea that no matter how good the games are, we're not going to get people to sell their PS5s. That's not really your goal. But I think what he's essentially saying is, since we're not really going to win loyalty that way, we need to win it in other ways. And it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, because if they can unify their ecosystem through mobile and through cloud and really have their games everywhere, and if they successfully somehow turn around the ABK deal, they'll have a lot of property to leverage, both in the cloud and mobile and PC, which those markets are significantly larger than console. Cloud's not larger yet, but it has the potential to be larger because it can essentially be everywhere in the way that mobile games are essentially everywhere. So let me know what you think in the comments below. Was Phil Spencer wrong? Did he overstate his case? Was he just trying to position things for the acquisition? I'd love to know what you think. Leave a comment below, and as always, hit subscribe, hit the like button, and I'll see you in the next one.